A bathysphere descends toward Rapture's shadowed spires, its glow swallowed by the abyss. Columbia's lighthouse splits the clouds, a beacon-turned relic. Looms unfettered, its markets angles sharp enough to cut the sky. Fades became the square. What if its decay was no accident, a slum built not from neglect but by design? Utopias are buried deepest where they begin. Beneath Rapture's lighthouse, Apollo Square festered, a concrete testament to unfettered markets. Its tenements, packed with Adam desperate, became the engine of Ryan's utopia. Every vial traded, every plasmid crafted, was a brick in a different future. The poor were not collateral, they were the foundation. Their suffering, the silent tax for a city built on extraction. Ryan's free market zeal permitted the Adam economy to bloom, but in Apollo Square, that bloom was a parasite, a city for the chosen. Its roots fed on the rot below. Utopias do not rice the leech. The silent code of Apollo Square was not in its bricks but in its purpose, a pressure valve, a sacrifice zone. Ryan's utopia required underclass not just to labor, but to leverage. Adam was currency, and suffering its mine. The plasmid trade, legal in Rapture's godless math, turned human wreckage into innovation. What did the spire dwellers trade for? Oxygen, their children's lungs. Their own lifespans siphoned into others' immortality. A city of winners needed losers to define its edges. Apollo Square was the shadow behind Ryan's monolith, the negative space of his creed. Its residents were not poor by accident, but by design. A slum that birthed rage, not rent thighs, was the silent code. Every stolen breath in that district fed the spire's glow. Every twisted body became a rung in the ladder of the elect. Ryan's economists called it equilibrium, a market correcting itself. But what equilibrium demands? A class of human beings exists solely to be consumed. The Adam economy did not just exploit. It required exploitation to function. A machine that needed rot in its gears to keep turning. The collapse was not an accident. It was an arithmetic inevitability. A city built on the premise that some lives are less than fuel could not long sustain its. The silent code was never in the architecture. It was in the equation, and in that equation, utopia was always a negative number. Apollo Square thrived, its spires clawed the sea. Every neon sign promised salvation, but salvation had a price. Little sisters clad in white harvested Adam from the dead. Their innocence was a lie. Tenenbaum and Suchong designed them as vectors, not of hope. Of harvest, each sister a ledger entry, each soul a currency. The poor flocked to their glow. Unseen, the equation tallied, then came the enforcers. Big sisters, Sophia Lamb's answer to disorder. Eleanor's voice warped into a weapon, conditioning stripped to its bones. These women were not guardians. They were corrections, a failed harvest, a lesson, a stray lover, a variable. Their power was not in strength. In the math that made compliance inevitable, the square's pulse was a paradox, rising wealth, rising debt, every transaction bound tighter. The poor traded breath for Adam, the rich traded morality for power. No one questioned the balance, until the balance was the question. What does a city built on extraction become when its lifeblood turns to ash? Apollo Square's collapse was not sudden, it was arithmetic. The same code that fed Rapture's golden age starved its bones. The equation had one solution, zero, and zero does not weep. Apollo Square's code was written in stone, a grid of concrete and compromise. Its alleys funneled more than sewage, they carried the arithmetic of survival. Below Rapture's gold, the poor were not citizens, they were variables. The revolt began with a spark, a stolen ration. A splicer's howl echoing through Fontaine's smuggling tunnels. Atlas had no army, only the broken, the addicted, the ones Ryan called unfit. But they knew the city's veins, they flooded them. Fontaine's rings were not rebellion, they were reply. Every smuggled vial of Adam, every black market breath, was a ledger entry against Ryan's lie. Autarky for the elite, dependency for the rest. Apollo Square's collapse was not accident, it was acceleration. The war began where the city's math failed. In 1958, the splicers rose not for chaos but for correction, to erase the denominator, to make zero scream. Ryan's architects built Apollo Square to contain, not to sustain. Its rot was not design flaw, it was doctrine. A proving ground for the theory that some lives are equations best set to zero. the fracture spread like a gas leak. From the slum's concrete lungs into Rapture's gilded arteries, the revolt was not the end, it was the first cough of a dying lung. A city that worshipped the self could not fathom the weight of its own code. What does a god do when his arithmetic breeds monsters? Apollo Square's walls did not merely crumble, they channeled collapse, a utopia's geometry twisted into a prison's logic. How does a city's design become a slow-burn rebellion? Its corridors bred isolation, not community. Elevators stalled at wrong floor accidents or arithmetic. A god's math cannot unbuild its own shadows. What if every brick in that slum was a cipher, encoding Rapture's final, inescapable equation? What if the poor were not failed by their god, but by the code he wrote to contain them? The architects called it a utopia, the residents called it a cage. Apollo Square's walls were thin, its corridors were thinner. Atom flowed through glass veins to the spire dwellers. The poor breathed rust and residue. Tenenbaum and Suchong wove their code with clinical precision. Little sisters were not prisoners, they were nodes. Their grief was a byproduct, their labor a battery. How many children processed how many drops before the system's first crack? Tenenbaum saw the math. She walked away, too late. The machine did not. It needed her equations to fail slower. The square's rot was not accidental, it was arithmetic. Overcrowding bred desperation. Desperation bred defiance. Defiance bred fire. The same atom that fueled ascension now seeped into veins like a slow poison. The architects had not built a city. They built a pressure valve, and pressure valves rupture. When the first spire cracked, Apollo Square did not weep, it exhaled. Tenenbaum's rebellion came after the math was done. She rescued ghosts. The system had already won. In the end, Rapture's collapse was not a crime. It was a forecast. The poor were not failed by their god. They were variables in his proof, and every variable must reach its limit. The lighthouse still stands, its beam long dead. It gazes upon Apollo Square's skeletal remains. Concrete ribs jut at broken angles, their geometry a language of desperation. Here, the poor did not merely live, they endured, in a calculus of claustrophobic corridors and ceilings that bled rust. The air hums with the arithmetic of decay. What did they build when they built downward? Not homes, a proving ground. The square's bones are a palimpsest. Each cracked wall whispers of a society that learned to collapse before the final detonation. Children's toys lie fossilized in dust, their fragility a mirror to the cities. The lighthouse, threshold between dream and ruin, does not judge. It remembers how the architects of Rapture folded poverty into their equations, how they called it efficiency. Oh, not for what was lost, but for what was never there. No foundation could hold the weight of a god who demanded worship in concrete and compromise. The code of Apollo Square was not in blueprints. It was in the silence between a leader's promises and a citizen's breath. The lighthouse saw it all, the first fracture, the first surrender. Rapture's fall was not an accident, it was an answer, and in Apollo Square the question was written in stone. What if Rapture's slum wasn't just poor, it was engineered to fail? Apollo Square's silent code bore 3 architects. Andrew Ryan let atom poison seep through tenement walls, trading human waste for profit margins. Sophia Lamb watched children drown in their own filth and called it a moral debt. Frank Fontaine laughed as both, smuggling hope through cracks in the system they claimed to serve. A city built on objectivist dogma rotted from the bottom up. Ryan's free market devoured its underclass. Lamb's cult promised salvation through violence. Fontaine's shadow trade proved Rapture's laws were paper-thin. Each man carved a path to ruin. Ryan saw laborers as resources. Lamb saw resources as sacrificial. Fontaine saw sacrifice as a tax. Their ideologies collided in Apollo Square's choking smog, where the desperate learned to breathe fire. Was this progress? Was this utopia? The code remained unspoken yet absolute. Let the weak shape the strong, and shape them they did. From atom-addled madness to revolution's red tide, Apollo Square's architects built their doom in brick and greed. The question was never in stone. It was in their choices, and the answer, a city drowned. Apollo Square's walls breathed decay. Flickering neon signs cast jagged shadows over concrete that cracked like old bones. The air reeked of salt and rust, a perfume of neglect. Below the surface, Charles Milton Porter's thinker pulsed in Minerva's den, its circuits humming with Ludus field equations blueprints for flight, for transcendence. But here in this slum, the same code that lifted Columbia into the clouds gnawed at Rapture's foundations. The thinker's algorithms, designed to optimize order, mirrored Apollo Square's labyrinthine chaos. Both were architectures of control, one in steel and one in data. Porter, a visionary blinded by his own genius, wove Ludesfield mathematics into the city's underbelly. He did not build prisons, he built ecosystems. Yet ecosystems demand balance. The poor, herded into this concrete maze, became variables in an equation they could not escape. Their struggles were not accidents. They were outputs. Above, Columbia soared on Ludesfield anti-grav, a city of spires and sermons. Below, Rapture's slum festered, its people trapped in a simulation of survival. The same technology that defied gravity here defied humanity there. Its people cities trapped in engines, hummed with simulation of survival, promises of salvation. Gravity here and others defied humanity there, whispered of entropy. The thinker, left to its own logic, could not distinguish between progress and collapse. It only calculated. Riots erupted where Apollo Square's alleys narrowed. The thinker, monitoring every flicker of unrest, adjusted parameters for routing resources, predicting failures. But prediction is not prevention. The code that mapped Rapture's doom was silent until the final hour. When the water rose, it carried both the architects and their arithmetic. Columbia still orbits the world they made. Its Ludesfields still bend reality. But in the ruins of Apollo Square, the thinker's core remains a fossil of failed equations. The code was never silent, it was waiting. The slum's bones were not flawed, they were faithful. Every steel beam, every concrete arch, mirrored the creed of a city that worshipped power above all. Apollo Square did not merely house the poor. It imprisoned them in a geometry of inevitability, a place where upward motion was a joke etched into the walls. The baths, the elevators, the airshafts, each a thread in a net designed to snare. Free will. A myth sold to those who could not see the ceiling was a vault, not a sky. The thinker's equations did not fail, they completed asterisk. A calculus of control that proved dominance corrupts even as it promises purity. Residents did not choose their paths. They followed gradients steeper than any stairwell, pulled by a gravity of scarcity and spectacle. The city's heart beat in the distance between the spire and the slum. Every innovation, every pipe and light was a lever in a machine that starved to feed its god. Technological overreach. No, this was technological faith asterisk. A belief that systems could refine humanity into perfection, blind to the rot festering in their own logic. Apollo Square was the first wound, the place where the ideology bled. Its silence was not absence. It was the hum of a code running its final loop-a-loop that said, all hierarchies are prisons. All utopias are countdowns. Rapture's fall was no accident, it was arithmetic. A city built on the lie that you can own the future could not outlast the math. The slum whispered the truth. The spire refused to listen, and when the code finally spoke, it did not plead. It calculated asterisk. The code's calculation was no accident. Apollo Square's design etched decay into Rapture's bones. Columbia's lighthouse stands as the next spire of reckoning. What secrets does its beam hold for those who